And it was just another evening, or at least it felt that way. The dull hum of the office always seemed to hang in the air, heavy and tired, no matter the time. I sat across from Hogus, my arms folded loosely over my lap, waiting for him to speak. His desk was cluttered, papers everywhere, a half-empty coffee mug sitting dangerously close to a stack of folders. He was pacing, something he always did when he was about to throw a tricky job my way.
You're going to like this one, Laura.
Hogus started, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Like isn't the word you use when I'm risking my neck, I replied, leaning back in the chair. Hogus gave a small smile, the kind he used when he thought he was softening the blow.
There's a werewolf, big one. He's suspected of destroying an old woman last month. A clean hit, no witnesses except claw marks that only one of their kind could leave.
I raised an eyebrow. You're telling me about clean hits like I don't know what they look like. He sat down across from me, his voice lowering.
Fair point. This guy's strong, Laura. I'm not sugarcoating it. The kind of strong where you might need backup.
I shook my head, already knowing where this was going. You know how I work, Hogus. No help, no interference. Just tell me where he is, and I'll do the rest. Hogus sighed, running a hand through his graying hair.
It's your funeral if it goes south.
Then I'll make sure it doesn't, I said firmly. But let's talk about payment. A job like this doesn't come cheap, especially if your intel's shaky. His expression turned into something like a grimace.
Always straight to business with you.
Of course. I'm not doing this for fun, I said, standing up and adjusting my leather jacket. Double my usual rate, Hogus. You know this isn't some run-of-the-mill hunt.
You don't leave me much choice, do you?
He leaned back in his chair.
Fine, but if you get yourself destroyed...
I won't, I interrupted. I'll be in touch when it's done. Without waiting for his reply, I turned and walked out of the office, my boots clicking against the tiled floor. The nightclub was already buzzing by the time I arrived. Neon lights flickered overhead, and the bass of the music thumped hard enough to rattle the walls. It wasn't exactly my scene, but tonight wasn't about me. It was Maeve's birthday, and she'd begged me to show up, so here I was. I spotted her almost immediately. She was on the dance floor, surrounded by a small group of her friends, laughing and moving to the rhythm, like she didn't have a care in the world. Her long red blonde hair, identical to mine, shimmered under the strobe lights. She saw me before I could call out, her face lighting up as she rushed over and threw her arms around me.
Laura,
she said, her excitement contagious.
you made it.
I said I would, I replied, hugging her back. Her happiness was genuine, and for a moment, it made me forget about everything else.
Dance with me,
she demanded, grabbing my hand and pulling me onto the floor before I could argue. It wasn't my favorite thing to do, but I indulged her, swaying to the music as she laughed and spun around me. It felt good to let go, even if just for a moment. The crowd around us was loud and energetic, their voices blending with the music in a chaotic harmony. After a while, Maeve's friends pulled her back into their circle, and I slipped away to the bar. I wasn't much of a drinker, but the idea of sitting down sounded nice. That's when I saw him, a man sitting alone at the end of the bar, nursing a drink like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He was handsome, in that rugged, unpolished way that drew attention without trying. Dark hair, sharp jawline, broad shoulders. But it was his eyes that caught me. Tired, distant, like he was carrying the weight of something he didn't want to share. He poured another drink, and then another, each one vanishing as quickly as it was poured. Easy there, I said as I slid into the stool next to him. You'll run out of liver before you run out of liquor. He looked at me, startled at first, then gave a half smile.
Guess I like testing limits.
Limits have a way of testing back, I replied, tilting my head toward his glass. Maybe call it a night?
And why would you care?
He asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Let's just say I've seen enough people drink themselves into bad decisions, I said. He chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that didn't quite match the sadness in his eyes.
Thomas.
He said after a moment.
Name's Thomas.
Laura, I replied. Nice to meet you, Thomas. We talked for a few minutes. Nothing deep, just small talk, but it was enough to convince him to stop drinking. He thanked me, and I left the bar, heading back to the apartment I shared with Maeve. By the time Maeve came home, I was already in bed, half asleep. The sound of the door closing pulled me out of my haze, and I got up to meet her in the living room. "How was your party?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe.
Awesome.
She said, her voice light and happy. She walked past me toward her room, but not before I noticed something in her hand. Her underwear, balled up and clutched tightly like she didn't want me to see it. I didn't say anything, just watched her disappear into her room. Whatever she'd been up to, it wasn't my business. Maeve had her own way of living, and as long as she was happy, I wasn't going to question it. Still, as I lay back down, my mind wandered to Thomas. There was something about him, something that felt unfinished. But that was a thought for another night. The morning sunlight seeped through the gaps in the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across my bedroom floor. My alarm hadn't gone off yet, but my internal clock knew better. I stretched, feeling the cool sheets brush against my legs, then swung them over the edge of the bed. It was going to be another long day. After a quick trip to the bathroom, I turned on the shower. The water was warm, almost scalding, just the way I liked it. Steam filled the room, wrapping me in a brief moment of peace. My thoughts wandered as I scrubbed my skin, planning the day ahead. By the time I was dressed in my usual fitted black jeans and a sleeveless top that hinted at curves, but didn't give too much away, I was ready to face whatever came next. That's when I heard it, a harsh, guttural sound, almost like someone retching. I froze, listening closely, before following the noise to the bathroom down the hall. "Maeve!" I called, cracking the door open. She was hunched over the sink, her face pale and damp with sweat. It wasn't hard to put two and two together. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Morning after pills, huh?" She groaned, not bothering to look at me.
Don't start, Laura.
"I wasn't going to," I said, walking away to the kitchen. "How about some coffee instead?" By the time she joined me at the table, her color had returned, though she still looked worn out. I slid a mug of black coffee toward her.
You heading out?
She asked, her voice rough. I nodded, sipping my own coffee. "Got a job. Don't wait up." Maeve smirked faintly, her tired eyes sparkling just a little.
I never do.
My next stop was a small house on the edge of town, tucked behind a patch of trees. Mrs. Keller opened the door before I could knock, her face lighting up as she saw me. "Laura, come in, come in. You'll stay for breakfast, won't you?" she insisted, ushering me inside without waiting for an answer. Her kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and something sweet, probably jam. I didn't have the heart to turn her down, so I accepted a slice and listened as she talked about her garden, her grandkids, and everything in between. "I'm so glad you're here," she said finally, setting her plate aside. "I need your help with Bruno." She disappeared into the back room and returned with her golden retriever. The poor thing was limping, a nasty gash on his front leg. I knelt down, brushing his fur gently. Bruno licked my hand, his tail wagging weakly. "Let's take care of this, buddy," I whispered, placing my palm over the wound. Healing always felt strange, like a warmth that started in my chest and traveled to my fingertips. Within seconds, the gash was gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken skin. Mrs. Keller clapped her hands together, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you, Laura. You're an angel." "Just doing what I can," I said with a small smile, giving Bruno a final pat before heading out. On my way back home, I saw him. Thomas. He was standing on the sidewalk, his broad shoulders tense, his hands clenched into fists. A beggar sat on the curb in front of him, his voice low but pleading. It didn't take a genius to figure out the situation was about to escalate. "Hey!" I called out, striding toward them. Thomas turned, his expression dark and unreadable. I didn't flinch, stopping just a few feet away. "What's going on here?"
It's nothing.
He muttered, but his tone was sharp, almost defensive. "It doesn't look like nothing," I replied, crossing my arms. "Leave him alone." Thomas stared at me for a moment, then sighed heavily, stepping back. The beggar didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his belongings and hurried off. I turned back to Thomas. "What's your deal?" He looked away, running a hand through his dark hair.
I've been off. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
"Why?" I pressed, softening my tone. "Why are you like this?" He hesitated, then said quietly,
My family thinks I'm a monster. They rejected me, even attacked me. I've been on my own ever since.
My eyes flicked to his side, where he was holding himself as if in pain. "They attacked you?" He nodded slowly. "Come with me," I said. His brow furrowed.
Why?
"I can heal you," I explained. "If you're hurt, I can help." He studied me, suspicion flickering in his eyes.
Are you a doctor?
"Not exactly," I said with a faint smile. "But let's just say it's a gift." Back at the apartment, I was unsurprised to find it empty. Maeve always had her own plans. I led Thomas to the living room, where the sunlight streamed in through the blinds, casting warm patterns on the floor. "Show me," I said. He hesitated.
You mean?
"Your injuries. Take off your shirt." He did as I asked, his movements slow and careful. Scars and fresh wounds marred his chest and sides, each one telling a story of violence and survival. I stepped closer, placing a hand over the largest gash on his chest. The warmth spread through me again, and I felt the injury knit itself together beneath my fingers. Thomas looked down, his eyes wide.
How did you?
"I told you, it's a gift," I said simply. "But I can only do so much in a day." He looked at me, still processing.
So, you can't heal the rest?
"Not today," I admitted. "I healed a dog earlier." He gave a short laugh, shaking his head.
This is unbelievable.
"It's just how it is," I said, stepping back. "Put your shirt on. You're decent now." We shared breakfast after that. Simple eggs and toast. The conversation was light, and for the first time he seemed relaxed. Before he left, he turned to me.
Would you mind if I came back tomorrow for more healing?
"I don't mind," I said, watching him leave. When I finally stepped into my office, the reality of the day hit me like a freight train. There, on my desk, were the files for my latest target. And staring back at me from the photo was Thomas. I sat at my desk, staring at the photo of Thomas pinned to the top of the file. His name was scribbled underneath in black ink, and my stomach churned with an uneasy mix of guilt and obligation. Picking up my phone, I hesitated for a moment before dialing Hogus. He answered on the second ring.
Laura, any updates?
"Just one question," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Is the target's name Thomas?"
Yes, Thomas. That's him. He's your target, Laura, and I'll be blunt. He's a dangerous werewolf. Doesn't know how to live with peace.
I swallowed hard, biting back the urge to tell him I'd already met the man. "Got it. I'll handle it."
Let me know if you need backup.
"I won't. You know I work alone." Before he could press further, I ended the call. My gaze drifted back to the photo, and I felt a twinge of something I didn't want to admit. Sympathy. Pushing the thought aside, I started going through the rest of the file, scanning his records, habits, and sightings. The more I learned, the harder it became to reconcile the man in front of me with the supposed monster in the file. After hours of staring at paperwork, my stomach reminded me it was time to eat. I headed into the kitchen, the cool tile floor grounding me as I moved between the fridge and counter. I settled on a simple meal, scrambled eggs and toast. By the time I sat down, the smell of butter and salt made me feel slightly better. Lunch was quick, and soon I was out the door again. I decided to check the street where I'd last seen Thomas arguing with that beggar. The late afternoon air carried the faint scent of gasoline and damp pavement, but Thomas was nowhere to be found. Frustrated but determined, I headed back to the apartment. As soon as I opened the door, I froze. Maeve was in my bed, tangled up with some man whose shirt was on the floor. She was wearing only her bra, and before I could see anything else, she grabbed the bedsheet and wrapped it around herself.
You're back early,
She said. Her voice edged with irritation as she quickly reached for her clothes. The man sat up, looking embarrassed as he pulled on his shirt.
I'm sorry.
He muttered before making a hasty exit. I stood there, my arms crossed. Seriously, Maeve? This isn't a hotel. And in my bed? You couldn't use your room? She glared at me, tossing the sheet aside as she pulled on her jeans.
Why do you care so much? It's not like you ever use it for anything fun.
That's not the point, I snapped. Have some respect for the space we share. Her expression hardened.
Maybe I'd respect it if you weren't so uptight all the time.
She grabbed her bag and stormed out before I could respond, slamming the door behind her. I let out a long breath, the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I tried calling her, but she ignored me, sending me straight to voicemail. The evening crept in, and just as I was about to pour myself a drink, my phone rang. Hogus again, he said.
I found something. Thomas lives on River Valley Street, a small rental house.
Thanks, I replied, already grabbing my jacket. Hogus asked,
Laura, if you want backup...
I don't, I cut him off. I told you, Hogus, I work alone. His sigh came through the line, but he didn't push it further. River Valley Street was quieter than I'd expected. The soft hum of cicadas filled the air, and the houses were modest, with chipped paint and overgrown yards. As I walked, I spotted Thomas near the edge of the street, talking to a police officer. At first, it looked like a casual conversation, but as I got closer, I noticed Thomas swaying slightly, his words slurred. The officer glanced my way as I approached.
Ma'am, are you with him?
Yes, I said, forcing a polite smile. The officer gave Thomas a pointed look.
This is your last warning. Next time you won't be so lucky.
Once he left, I turned to Thomas. What the hell was that about? Thomas shrugged, his gaze distant.
I was drinking and stepped in front of his car. Guess I wasn't paying attention.
You think that's an excuse? I asked, my frustration slipping through. If I hadn't been here, you'd be spending the night in a cell. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck.
You're right. Thanks. Coffee?
He added suddenly, his tone lighter. I raised an eyebrow. If you insist. Thomas's house was small, just like Hogus described. The living room was sparsely furnished, a couch, a coffee table, and a few books stacked on the floor. You live here alone? I asked, sitting on the couch. He leaned against the doorway, his expression darkening.
Told you, no family anymore.
The words hung heavy between us. I stood, brushing past him toward the kitchen. I'll make the coffee. He didn't protest, settling into the couch as I rummaged through his cabinets. The kitchen was neat, almost too neat, as if he barely used it. I found the coffee tin, and while it brewed, I took in the details. A single mug by the sink, a faint smell of pine, a faded photo stuck to the fridge with a magnet. We drank our coffee in the living room, and for the first time, Thomas seemed relaxed. I kept the conversation light, steering him away from his past, and for a while he smiled, a real smile. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to the door.
See you in the morning.
Yeah, I said. Morning. Back at the apartment, the emptiness was stifling. Maeve's absence felt like a shadow hanging over the room. I tried calling her again, but she sent me straight to voicemail. Changing into a loose nightshirt, I sat at the kitchen table, picking at a quick dinner of leftovers. The silence was oppressive, and my thoughts kept drifting to Thomas, his words, his wounds, and the secrets he carried. By the time I climbed into bed, sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the events of the day, lingering on the unanswered questions that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. I woke up to the sound of a soft knock at my door. Groggy and still half asleep, I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the clock. It was early, too early for Maeve to be back. She usually took her time. I stretched, trying to pull myself together. Quickly, I adjusted the loose shirt I was wearing and shuffled toward the door. I was expecting Maeve. Maybe she'd finally come home after our fight. But when I opened it, I froze. Standing in front of me was Thomas. "Early, aren't you?" I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. He didn't seem to notice. He looked worn out.
I'm not feeling too great.
He said, his voice raspy.
I think I might have had a little too much last night.
He stepped inside, moving past me like he had every right to be there. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I didn't stop him. He sank into the couch, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Let me make you some coffee," I offered, trying to keep things casual. He nodded, almost gratefully.
Yes, please.
I walked to the kitchen, each step feeling more deliberate than the last. The sound of the coffee machine brewing filled the quiet apartment. As I waited for it to finish, my mind raced. Was I really doing this? Was I really going to help him like this, knowing what he was, and what I had to do? When the coffee was ready, I poured it into a cup and brought it over to him. He took it from me without a word, his fingers brushing mine for a second. I couldn't help but notice the way he seemed to clutch the cup, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "You feel better after the last time I healed you, right?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. He met my eyes and gave a small, tired smile.
Yeah, I did. That's why. I was hoping you could heal me again. Please?
I leaned against the armrest, watching him closely. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Was it desperation? Or was it just exhaustion? I couldn't ignore it. "I can heal you," I said softly. "I'll heal all your wounds, but you have to trust me." He didn't hesitate.
I trust you.
I took a deep breath, then sat down next to him. "Take your shirt off," I said gently. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he complied. Slowly, he pulled the fabric over his head, revealing the scars that covered his chest. There was one in particular that caught my attention, a jagged, deep wound, still healing. I placed my fingers lightly on it, feeling the warmth of his skin under my touch. He flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. I closed my eyes, focusing on the energy inside me, letting it flow into him, healing the wound. It took longer than I expected, but eventually, the wound began to fade. His breathing slowed as I worked, the tension in his body easing. When I finished, I pulled my hand back and looked up at him. "You should rest for a bit," I suggested. "I'll heal the rest after a while." Thomas nodded and stood up, slipping his shirt back on.
Thanks.
He murmured, his voice soft.
I'm sorry for taking up your time.
"It's fine," I said, trying to ignore the way his apology made me feel. "You should take a shower. You're smelling a little rough." He gave me a weak smile.
Yeah, I guess I do.
I handed him a towel and pointed toward the bathroom. "In there." As he stepped into the bathroom, I couldn't help but follow him with my eyes, the thoughts swirling in my head. I walked over to the sofa, sitting down slowly, trying to calm my mind. I listened intently for any sound from the bathroom, but all I heard was the faint rush of water and the quiet movements of someone bathing. I sat back, trying to clear my head. It wasn't long before the bathroom door opened, and Thomas stepped out, the smell of soap and fresh water hanging in the air. His clothes were the same, worn, but he looked clean. He looked different, like he had shed a layer of the pain that had been clinging to him.
Thanks for letting me use your bathroom.
He said, his voice more grounded now. You're welcome, I replied, my voice quieter than before. He hesitated, then looked at me.
Do you mind if I rest in your room for a while?
He asked. I pointed toward Maeve's room. Take a nap in there, I said. I'll be in the kitchen. I waited until he closed the door behind him, then I stood up and quietly locked it from the outside. I needed to be sure. There was too much at stake to risk anything going wrong. I stepped back into the living room and called Hogus. Thomas is here, I said, my voice low. Should I finish him? There was a pause before Hogus answered.
It's not that simple, Laura. If you try to finish him, he'll attack, and it could cost you your life. Be careful.
I didn't respond right away. I knew what I had to do, but I wasn't sure I could go through with it. Okay, I said finally. I'll handle it. I hung up and unlocked the door to Maeve's room, moving quietly as I stepped inside. Thomas was fast asleep, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before. His body was still battered, but he looked at peace for the first time in a long while. I didn't wake him. Instead, I left the room, pulling the door shut behind me with a soft click. I needed to think. I grabbed my phone again and dialed Maeve. This time, she picked up on the first ring.
Laura,
She said, her voice soft.
I'm sorry, I was rude before.
It's okay, I replied, my tone more forgiving than I felt. But I need you to come back soon. I'm worried about you. Maeve's voice faltered.
I found something, but it's not good. I'll explain when I get back, okay?
Of course, I said, hanging up. I moved into the kitchen to make lunch, but my mind wasn't on the food. It was on Thomas. What was I doing? What had I gotten myself into? A little while later, Thomas came into the kitchen, looking a little more alert.
I slept for a bit.
He said apologetically.
I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time.
It's fine, I said again, trying to keep my voice steady. Sit down. I'll heal your last injury. He walked into the living room, and I made another cup of coffee, just for him this time. I couldn't help but smile as I handed it to him. He took a sip, his eyes closing for a second.
This is really good.
He said. Glad you like it, I replied. I waited a moment, then spoke. Take your shirt off, Thomas. Let me finish this. He complied, and I touched the last wound on his body, healing it just as I had done before. When I was done, he stood up, brushing himself off.
I should go. I've taken up enough of your time. Thanks again for everything.
I smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. Come by around 8 tonight. I'll make you something special, a drink that'll help heal you faster. He looked at me, his expression soft.
I'll be there. Thanks, Laura.
As he left, I closed the door behind him, my mind racing with everything I had yet to decide. What was I getting myself into? I picked up the phone, glancing at the screen. It was Hogus again. I answered, trying to sound calm, though inside my thoughts were running wild.
Laura, is everything okay? Do you need anything?
Hogus's voice came through, steady and professional as always. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, feeling the weight of the day settle in. Yeah, I said, my voice softer than usual. Just wanted to update you. I've been giving Thomas the poison slowly. Coffee. He drinks it every time I make it for him. It's working. He's getting weaker. Soon, when the time is right, I'll finish him. Hogus paused on the other end, then spoke again, his tone serious but thoughtful.
But first, Laura, you have to earn his trust. That's the key.
I leaned forward, resting my hand on the edge of the counter. I've already started. I've been helping him with his wounds, and I can tell he's starting to trust me. It's working. He believes in me now. There was a long silence. Then Hogus finally said,
Good, stay on course. I'll be here if you need anything else.
I hung up the phone, the weight of his words heavy in my chest, earning his trust. I wasn't sure if I liked the idea of it, but I had no choice. The job had to be done. I stood up and moved toward the stove, the smell of lunch filling the air. I didn't feel hungry, but I had to eat, to keep up appearances. While stirring the pot, I called Maeve. "When are you coming back?" I asked, my voice sounding more casual than I felt. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, reminding me how much I hated waiting.
Like I said,
Maeve's voice came through the speaker.
in the evening, I'm busy with my friends.
I sighed, not wanting to press too hard, but curiosity gnawed at me. "I'm curious. You said you found something. I can't wait to hear about it." Maeve hesitated, then said,
All right, I'll be back in 20 minutes. Wait for me.
"I'll be here," I said, hanging up the phone. I wandered to the window and looked outside, the world still moving. People were walking along the streets, carrying on with their lives. I envied them. They didn't have to live with the weight of a past they couldn't escape. "This chemical will slow your body, your mind, your power, Thomas," I muttered to myself, staring at my reflection in the glass. But why does it feel so wrong? Why do I feel this tug, this sympathy for him? I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts. It was a distraction I couldn't afford. Then I heard a knock at the door. I stood up immediately, moving with purpose. It was Maeve. She looked different. There was something in her eyes, something serious, as though she had just come from a battle of her own. I opened the door and stepped back, letting her in. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice softer now. "I was worried." She closed the door behind her and turned to face me, her eyes locking with mine.
There's something you need to know.
She said, her tone steady but filled with an urgency I hadn't heard before. I led her to the sofa and we sat down. "What is it?" I asked, my heart quickening as I wondered what could possibly be so important. Maeve took a deep breath and began.
One of my friends, the one who lives in the other town, where the werewolves are active, she told me something strange. There was this woman, a beggar, who lived near her house. She was always around, carrying a photo. My friend always gave her food, money. One day, my friend asked her whose picture she was carrying. The woman said, "They're my daughters. It was our photo."
I felt my chest tighten. "Our photo?" I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips. "The woman was carrying our photo?" Maeve nodded slowly.
Yes, it was our photo. The woman was our mother, Laura. She was mentally disturbed after what her husband did to her. He was experimenting on her, trying to change her. And it broke her. She still remembers us.
A wave of shock and grief hit me, and I blinked hard to fight back the tears. "Where is she now? Where's our mother? We should bring her home." Maeve's eyes darkened.
She's gone. A dangerous werewolf, someone cruel, someone wild, hunted her down. She didn't survive.
I felt the ground beneath me shift, as if the world had just tilted on its axis. It was Thomas. It had to be him. I felt my throat tighten, the air around me suddenly feeling too thick, too heavy. "Thomas, I whispered, my voice shaking. He finished her, didn't he? Maeve didn't answer right away. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn photo. She handed it to me silently. It was the picture our mother had carried. I looked at it closely, my eyes tracing the faces in the photo. 2 little girls, barely more than toddlers. Maeve and I. I didn't even recognize the face of our mother. She had been a blur in my memories, a distant figure I couldn't bring myself to recall. And now, the photo. The last thing she had left us. Tears blurred my vision as I held the photo, but I didn't care. I wiped them away quickly, my heart aching in ways I didn't know how to process. I was just a child when she left us. I can't even remember the last time I saw her, I whispered. Maeve's voice was gentle as she spoke.
You would be only 3 or 4. I don't remember much either. But I know one thing, Laura. I have you. And that's enough for me.
I pulled Maeve into a tight hug, the weight of everything crashing down. I didn't have the words to say what I needed to say. Instead, I just held her, feeling the comfort of her presence.
We'll forget this. Let's just eat, okay?
Maeve said, pulling back slightly and wiping her eyes. I have you, and you have me. We're not alone. I smiled through the tears, kissing her forehead gently. You're right. Let's eat. I stood and moved toward the dining table, setting the plates down for both of us. We ate together, in silence mostly, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes, of grief, of loss, of understanding. When we finished, Maeve got up and kissed my cheek.
I'm going out to meet some friends. You'll be all right here?
Yeah, I said, my voice steady. I'll be fine. She left, and I was alone again. But not for long. Later that evening, when the clock struck 7, a soft knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I stood up, a sense of anticipation welling up inside me. It was Thomas. I opened the door, and there he was, standing in the hallway with that same tired look in his eyes.
Good evening, Laura.
He said, his voice warm as always. But there was something different about him today. He seemed more vulnerable. He walked past me and sat on the sofa, his eyes scanning the room for a moment before he spoke again.
I hope I'm not interrupting.
I closed the door quietly behind me and turned to face him. Not at all, I replied, my voice calm, almost too calm. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes.
I'm glad. I've been thinking about everything you said, about healing, about trust.
He paused, looking down at his hands.
I don't have much left, but I trust you, Laura.
My stomach tightened, but I didn't show it. Thomas, I said softly, stepping closer to him. You must feel so lonely, right? He looked at me, his gaze a little distant.
It's obvious, isn't it?
I nodded, my heart aching for him in ways I didn't understand. You can share with me, whatever you want, if you feel comfortable. He turned toward me, his eyes searching mine.
I've never committed any crime. I need to prove my innocence. My family, my pack, they won't let me live this down. Even if I'm far away, I'll always be their failure.
I almost felt sorry for him. He was such an excellent liar, his words so carefully chosen. But I knew better. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was Hogus. I didn't pick it up. Thomas looked at me, confused.
Something wrong?
He asked, but I brushed it off with a smile. You were expecting a drink, weren't you? I said, changing the subject. I'll make that for you.
That sounds nice.
I stepped into the kitchen and started preparing the meal. As I did, I slipped the poison into the drink, the same slow poison that would eventually weaken him to the point of no return. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I walked back into the living room, the glass in hand. I handed it to him, my fingers brushing his as he took it. He drank it quickly, then set the empty glass on the table.
That's good.
He said.
Really good.
I smiled, trying to hide my satisfaction. I'm glad you like it. He looked up at me.
You're a good person, Laura. I can see that now. I don't know why, but I trust you.
I felt a pang in my chest, but I didn't let it show. Thank you, I said, my voice soft. That means a lot. Thomas stood up, his expression serious now.
Maybe we can meet again at my place, 9 p.m. Can we have dinner too?
I smiled. Of course, I said. Let me get everything ready. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll be there. With a last smile, Thomas turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and a plan that was slowly unfolding, one piece at a time. I couldn't deny it anymore. Thomas had started getting under my skin. I hated myself for it. I'd promised Hogus I'd stick to the plan. Thomas had finished my mother, hadn't he? He deserved to suffer. But why did everything about him, his polite manner, his tired eyes, his quiet sadness, make me doubt everything? I shook the thoughts from my head. I couldn't afford to be soft. Not now, not ever. It was late evening, and I needed to get ready to visit him. I set an alarm for 7:30 p.m. and decided to lie down for a while. Sleep came quickly, pulling me under like a tide. Then I saw. The house was quiet, the air heavy with tension. I knocked on Thomas's door, but no one answered. When I peered through the window, the house was empty. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw it. A massive gray werewolf stood a few feet away, its growls low and guttural. Its claws gleamed like polished daggers under the moonlight. My breath hitched, and before I could scream, it lunged at me. I jolted awake, gasping for air, my body damp with sweat. My hands clutched at the sheets, and it took me a moment to realize I was in my bed. Just a dream, but the fear felt too real to brush off. My fingers trembled as I pushed my hair back from my face and whispered, "Thank God. It wasn't real." I didn't trust Thomas, but the idea of him attacking me still seemed far-fetched. Yet, the dream clung to me, gnawing at my confidence like a stubborn splinter. I shook it off, deciding to focus on the night ahead. I slipped into a plunging black dress that clung to my figure just enough to leave an impression. The neckline dipped low, but it was elegant, not overdone. I spent extra time on my makeup, just a touch of eyeliner and red lipstick to highlight my features. I swept my hair into a loose, tousled style, letting a few strands frame my face. The final touch was the small vial of slow-acting poison, hidden carefully in the waistband of my black thong. I had to stay sharp, no matter how much my emotions tried to sway me. When I knocked on Thomas's door, he opened it almost immediately, a faint smile on his lips.
Welcome to my humble little house.
Thanks, I said, stepping inside. The place was simple but tidy, with an old sofa, a small coffee table, and a few shelves lined with books.
You look beautiful.
He said, his voice warm but hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he should say it. Thank you, I replied, giving him a small smile.
Would you like some coffee?
He asked. For a moment, I hesitated. What if he'd figured everything out? What if he'd put something in the coffee? The thought sent a shiver through me. No, that's okay, I said quickly. I'll make it. He raised an eyebrow, but he didn't argue.
All right, as you wish.
I walked into the kitchen, aware of his presence behind me. His house smelled faintly of cedarwood and something else, something earthy. I busied myself with the coffee, pretending to be calm, but my mind was racing. As I handed him a cup, he said,
You know you're different.
How so? I asked, sitting down on the sofa across from him.
You are guarded,
He said, choosing his words carefully.
but there's something kind about you. Like you're carrying the weight of the world, but you still care about people.
I almost laughed at the irony. If only he knew. Maybe, I said softly. He sipped his coffee, his eyes studying me.
Do you have a boyfriend?
I tilted my head, pretending to think. I guess I'm not that lucky. My work keeps me busy, and relationships don't exactly fit into the picture. He smiled faintly.
Hard to believe. Any man would fall for you.
And there it was, the moment I'd been waiting for. I met his gaze, letting the corner of my mouth curve into a playful smile. Who knows? His laughter was soft, almost bittersweet.
When I drink coffee at your place, it's always better. I don't know why.
Maybe it's the company, I teased. He smiled, but his eyes carried a shadow of something else. Sadness, maybe, or regret.
Let's take a walk before dinner.
He said in a romantic mood. I hesitated. My instincts told me not to, but I couldn't let him see my fear. Sure, I said, standing up. Outside, the air was cool, the moon hanging low in the sky. We walked side by side in silence for a while, until he spoke.
Could you help me find a job?
He asked, his voice low. I looked at him, surprised. You need a job?
I want to live.
He said simply.
I want a chance to start over.
His words caught me off guard. There was no malice in them, no hidden agenda, just a quiet plea. I'll see what I can do, I said. He stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression was unreadable, his voice quieter now.
Do you ever have dreams?
The question took me by surprise. What kind of dreams?
Any.
He said, his gaze unwavering. I hesitated, unsure of where this was going. Not really. He frowned slightly.
I had one. About you.
My stomach tightened. What do you mean?
I saw you.
He said, his voice carrying a strange tension.
You were walking toward my house, but something attacked you before you got there. It wasn't human. It was something else.
The air seemed to shift around us, the weight of his words sinking in. It was just a dream, I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was softer.
I'm glad you're safe.
I didn't know what to say. The way he looked at me, like he was searching for answers, made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I should go, I said abruptly, turning to leave.
Why, Laura?
He said behind me. When I turned back to reply, he was gone. I quickened my pace, unease settling in my chest. But then I stopped dead in my tracks. A massive gray werewolf stood in the shadows, its amber eyes glowing. My breath caught, and I took a step back. It growled low and deep, its muscles coiled. Before it could attack, a blur of black fur barreled into it. The two creatures clashed, snarling and snapping, their movements almost too fast to follow. The gray werewolf retreated, its growls fading into the night. The black werewolf stood still for a moment, its piercing blue eyes locked on me. Then, slowly, it began to shift. The fur receded, muscles and bones twisting and reshaping, until Thomas stood before me, naked under the pale light of the moon. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare.
It's okay.
He said softly.
You're safe now.
For the first time, I wasn't so sure. Thomas held my hand. He took me inside his house. I was scared, confused. I sat across from Thomas in his dimly lit living room, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest like an invisible force. He looked at me, his eyes carrying something I couldn't quite place. Regret, fear, maybe even longing. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak but didn't know where to start. The silence between us felt heavy, but I didn't break it. I wanted him to speak on his own, to trust me enough to let me in. His hands rested on his knees, his fingers tapping nervously. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, grounding me in the moment. Finally, he took a deep breath and said,
Laura, I need to tell you something. It's not easy, but you deserve to know.
I tilted my head slightly, encouraging him to continue. Go on, I said softly. His jaw tightened, and his gaze dropped to the floor.
I'm not just a man.
He began, his voice low and raw.
I'm different. I'm a werewolf, as you can see now.
The words didn't hit me like a sudden gust of wind, but I kept my face pretending to be surprised. I had known this already, but hearing him admit it out loud gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. He glanced up at me, searching my face for a reaction.
I know how it sounds,
He added quickly.
but it's the truth. I wasn't born like this. It's something I inherited, something I never asked for.
I folded my hands in my lap, careful to keep my voice steady. Thomas, why are you telling me this now?
Because you're the first person in years who's looked at me like I'm human.
He admitted, his voice breaking slightly.
Everyone else sees me as a monster, Laura. And after what happened with the old woman last month, I don't blame them.
He paused, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his body seemed to carry the weight of his words. I leaned forward slightly, my fingers brushing against the edge of the coffee table. What happened with her, Thomas? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair.
It was a mistake. A horrible, tragic mistake.
His voice cracked, and for the first time I saw tears glistening in his eyes.
I was patrolling the woods near my pack's territory.
He began, his voice heavy with emotion.
It was late at night and the moon was full. I shifted into my wolf form. It's something we do to protect the pack, to keep the area safe. That's when I heard her screams.
I swallowed hard, my eyes locked on his face. He wasn't just telling a story, he was reliving it.
There was another werewolf,
He continued, his tone darkening.
a rogue. He'd been causing trouble near the borders, attacking livestock, scaring the locals. I found him in the woods, attacking her, an elderly woman who had no business being out there at that hour. She was terrified, struggling to get away.
His hands clenched into fists, and I could see the veins in his arms tense.
I didn't think. I just acted. I lunged at the rogue, trying to get him away from her. There was so much chaos, growling, snapping, her screams, and then silence.
He closed his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper.
When it was over, the rogue was gone, but she was lying there on the ground. She'd been caught in the middle. I tried to help her, Laura. I shifted back to human form, held her in my arms, begged her to stay with me, but it was too late.
I felt a lump form in my throat, but I forced it down.
When the others arrived, they saw me there, covered in blood, holding her lifeless body.
He said bitterly.
They didn't care about the rogue. They didn't care about the truth. To them, I was the monster who took away her life. And no matter how much I begged, no one believed me.
His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands.
They exiled me, Laura. Stripped me of my title, my family, my home. I've been running ever since.
The room fell silent again, the weight of his story settling over us like a thick fog. I didn't know what to say. I had prepared myself to hate him, to see him as nothing more than a target. But now, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with desperation.
You have to understand, Laura. I didn't took away her life. I tried to save her, but I failed. And now I have to live with that every day.
I pressed my lips together, my emotions a tangled mess. Sympathy, doubt, anger. It was all swirling inside me, and I couldn't sort it out.
There's something else.
He said, his voice softer now.
You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be near me.
I frowned, my chest tightening. What are you talking about?
I mean it.
he insisted, his tone urgent.
You're in danger just by being around me. My enemies, they won't stop. They'll come after anyone close to me. You saw what happened, didn't you? That wasn't random, Laura. It was a warning.
I swallowed hard, memories of the werewolf attack flashing through my mind. You think they'll come after me again?
I know they will,
He said firmly.
and I can't let that happen. You deserve better than this. Better than me.
His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I couldn't speak. He was trying to push me away, to protect me, but all it did was make me want to stay. Thomas, I said quietly, leaning forward, you're not a monster. Whatever happened with that woman, I believe you. And as for your enemies, I can handle myself. He shook his head, his expression pained.
You don't understand. They're not like anything you've dealt with before. They're ruthless, relentless, and I won't be able to forgive myself if something happens to you because of me.
Let me decide what I can handle, I said firmly, my voice steady. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine.
Why are you doing this?
He asked softly.
Why are you here, Laura?
I hesitated, the truth caught in my throat. Because I don't think you're as bad as you think you are, I said finally. And maybe you don't have to go through this alone. His gaze softened, and for a moment, it felt like the walls he'd built around himself were beginning to crumble. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine.
I don't deserve your kindness.
He whispered. And I don't need your permission to give it, I replied, my voice firm. For the first time since I'd met him, he smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
You're something else, Laura.
You're just figuring that out now? I teased, trying to lighten the mood. He laughed softly, but the sadness never left his expression.
Promise me one thing.
He said. What's that?
If things get dangerous, if it comes down to it, you'll walk away. You'll save yourself.
I hesitated, then gave a small nod. I'll think about it. He didn't push the issue, and for the rest of the night we sat in his living room, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in a long time, it felt like he was letting someone in. And for reasons I couldn't fully understand, I wanted to be that person. It was past midnight, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. I sat on Thomas's couch, my fingers tracing absent patterns on the fabric of my dress. The thought of going home crossed my mind more than once, but the weight of the evening still hung in the air between us. I glanced at him, standing by the window, his silhouette barely visible in the faint glow of the moonlight.
Please.
He said, turning to face me. His voice was soft, almost hesitant.
Stay with me. Who knows if you'll ever meet me again after tonight?
I tilted my head slightly, his words catching me off guard. Why would you say something like that? Of course, we'll meet in the morning like always, I replied, trying to sound casual, though his tone had me on edge. He stepped closer, his presence filling the small room.
Stay with me.
He said again, his eyes searching mine. There was something in the way he said it, something unspoken. I felt my defenses falter. Okay, I said simply, though my voice came out softer than I intended. Thomas looked relieved but hesitant, as if he'd crossed some invisible line by asking.
Do you need some clothes to change into?
He asked after a moment. I raised an eyebrow. Do you have women's clothes lying around? He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips.
Not at all.
Then why'd you even ask? I shot back, crossing my arms.
You could try some of mine.
He said, his tone light.
They're loose enough. Probably not the worst thing you've slept in.
I rolled my eyes but couldn't hide my grin. Really? Fine. Give me something decent. Thomas disappeared into his bedroom and returned a minute later with a folded t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants that looked like they'd swallow me whole. I took them from him and pointed toward the bathroom. Wait here, I said. He nodded, well, gave me a slight tilt of his head, and stepped outside the front door. I could hear the faint crunch of gravel as he moved, giving me space. In the bathroom, I slipped out of my dress and pulled on his clothes. The t-shirt hung loose on me, the hem falling mid-thigh, and the sweatpants were so oversized I had to roll them at the waist just to keep them up. His scent clung to the fabric, a mix of pine and something musky, making me pause for a second. When I opened the door, he was standing outside, leaning against the porch railing, his arms crossed over his chest. The night air was cool and his silhouette was sharp against the moonlit backdrop. "Come inside," I called softly. He turned, his eyes falling on me, and for a second, he froze.
Not bad.
He said, stepping closer.
You look even more beautiful in that outfit.
I felt a blush creep up my neck, but I hid it behind a teasing smile. Flattery won't get you out of sleeping on the couch. Thomas chuckled, his voice low. He stepped closer, his expression softening.
You really have no idea what you're doing to me, do you?
Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me gently on the cheek. The warmth of his lips sent a wave of something unfamiliar through me, something I couldn't quite put into words.
Don't play with fire.
He murmured, his voice a whisper against my skin.
You'll get burned.
I met his gaze, the space between us electric. I want to get burned, I replied, my voice steady. That was all it took. He closed the distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was anything but gentle. It was deep, urgent, full of everything he'd been holding back. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself fall into it, into him. When he moved to kiss my neck, his breath warm against my skin, I felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. But then, just as suddenly, I stepped back, placing a hand on his chest. "Good night," I said softly, though my voice was unsteady. Thomas looked at me, his expression unreadable.
Where am I supposed to sleep?
He asked after a moment. I smirked, pointing toward the living room. "Sofa." He sighed but didn't argue, retreating to the couch while I climbed into the bed. The sheets were soft, cool against my skin, but sleep didn't come easily. I could hear his breathing from the other room, slow and steady, and I envied how quickly he seemed to fall asleep. Once I was sure he was out, I slipped out of bed, careful not to make any noise. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound louder than it was. I moved through the rooms slowly, scanning the shelves, the tables, looking for something. I didn't even know what, but I felt compelled to search. It was in the corner of his bedroom, on a small cluttered desk, that I found it. A photo, tucked beneath a pile of papers. I picked it up, squinting in the dim light. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked, rubbed them, looked again. It was unmistakable. Thomas, younger, standing beside someone I knew all too well. Hogus. They looked different, both of them younger, but there was no denying it. The photo was old, worn at the edges, but clear enough to confirm what I was seeing. I slipped the photo into my pocket and crept out of the house, my mind racing. The cool night air hit me as I started running, my bare feet barely making a sound on the dirt path. The journey back to my apartment felt longer than usual, every shadow in the trees making my pulse quicken. When I finally reached the door, I pushed it open quietly, not wanting to wake Maeve. But the sound must have stirred her, because she appeared in the hallway, her hair messy from sleep.
Laura, are you all right?
She asked, her voice groggy. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, though my tone betrayed me. "But I need to know something. It's important." Maeve rubbed her eyes and sat down at the kitchen table.
What is it?
I joined her, pulling the photo from my pocket and laying it on the table. "Do you know Hogus, my colleague? I've worked with him a lot."
Of course,
she said.
I've seen him a few times when he came by the house.
I nodded, my fingers tapping the table. I found this in Thomas's house, I said, sliding the photo toward her. Maeve's brow furrowed as she studied it.
Thomas? Who's that? Are you dating someone?
It's complicated, I admitted. But yeah, you could say that. And now I'm starting to think he's more dangerous than I realized. Her eyes widened.
Dangerous? What do you mean?
I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. Hogus hired me to hunt Thomas. He told me Thomas was a threat. And now I find this. I pointed to the photo. Why didn't he tell me he already knew Thomas? Maeve looked at me, her expression serious.
That doesn't make sense. If Hogus and Thomas knew each other, why keep it a secret? Something's not adding up, Laura. You need to find out the truth.
I hesitated. Should I call him? Maeve didn't hesitate.
Do it.
I grabbed my phone and dialed Hogus's number. He answered on the second ring. Hogus, I said, not bothering with pleasantries. I found a photo of you and Thomas together. Why didn't you tell me you knew him? There was a pause on the other end before he replied.
Because it's none of your business.
He said bluntly.
Thomas was someone we all trusted once. He protected people, animals, forests, but underneath it all, he was a monster. He hunted people, Laura. He hunted your mother and some of my close friends.
My blood ran cold. But Thomas had told me something differently.
I have proof.
Hogus said firmly.
Come to me, and I'll show you. Thomas is a liar. He always tells a new story to every woman he meets with.
I clenched my jaw, my mind spinning. Okay, I trust you, I said finally.
Finish the job before he finds out what you're up to,
he said before hanging up. I sat there, the phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. When I explained everything to Maeve, she leaned back in her chair, her expression grim.
Then we'll finish it,
she said.
Together. If he hunted our mother, he'll pay for it.
I didn't respond, doubt creeping in despite my trust in Hogus. For the first time, I wasn't sure what to believe. I woke up to the faint morning light peeking through the curtains, brushing against my face. The air in my room felt still, but my mind was anything but. The events of last night kept replaying in my head like a broken record. Hogus's words, the photo, and the strange mix of doubt and conviction sitting heavy in my chest. I stretched my arms, feeling the weight of the decision I had to make today. Maeve was already in the kitchen, sipping coffee from her favorite chipped mug. She wore an oversized sweatshirt, her hair tied in a loose bun, but her sharp eyes gave away that she'd been up for a while. Morning, I said, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. She looked up at me, her expression serious.
We need to talk.
I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma grounding me for a moment. About what?
About Thomas, of course.
She said, leaning forward slightly.
We need to end this before it goes any further. You know that, right?
I stared into my coffee, watching the ripples as I stirred in a splash of cream. I know, I murmured.
We could use hard poison.
Maeve suggested.
Something quick, clean. No mess, no risk of him transforming.
Her words felt like a punch to the gut, but I knew she was right. Fine, I said quietly. We'll do it tonight. Maeve raised an eyebrow.
You sure?
I nodded, keeping my eyes on the coffee. Yes. After breakfast, I got dressed. Black jeans, a fitted leather jacket, and boots. Something practical but sharp. I grabbed the small vial Maeve handed me, its contents clear and harmless looking. As I slipped it into my pocket, a part of me felt like I was carrying a storm in my hand. Then one of my friends called me and asked me to help her to heal her dog. I had to help her. She was my old friend. I knocked on the door, stepping back as it creaked open almost immediately. My friend, Clara, peeked out, her dark curls framing her face in a messy halo. Her expression softened when she saw me, but I could tell something was weighing on her. "Laura, thank God," she said, swinging the door open fully. "You've got to help me. Buster's not doing well." I followed her inside without hesitation, the scent of lavender candles and freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Clara's home always felt warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the chaos I was dealing with lately. "What happened?" I asked, glancing around the living room until my eyes landed on Buster, her golden retriever, lying on his side near the couch. Clara sighed, crouching beside him. "He's been limping all day, and now he won't even get up. I don't know what to do. He's my baby, Laura." Her voice cracked at the end, and I crouched down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "Let me see," I said softly, turning my attention to the dog. Buster's big, soulful eyes looked up at me, his tail wagging weakly, as if he was trying to put on a brave face for us. I ran my hands gently over his leg, feeling for anything out of place. "It's probably just a sprain," I said after a moment. "He might have jumped off something the wrong way." Clara's shoulders relaxed a little. "Can you help him? You're good at this stuff, Laura. You always know what to do." I smiled faintly. "Let me try." I healed the dog. I scratched behind his ears when I was done, earning a soft whine of appreciation. "There you go, buddy. Just keep him off his feet for a few days, and he'll be fine." Clara exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you. You have no idea how much this means to me." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Hogus's name flashing on the screen. "1 second," I said, stepping toward the kitchen for some privacy. "Hogus?"
Laura,
he said, his tone clipped.
what's the update on Thomas?
I glanced back toward the living room, lowering my voice. "I haven't gotten to him yet. I was held up." Hogus sighed on the other end.
You need to act fast. He's clever, Laura. He won't stay in one place for long. Corner him. Lure him out with something he can't resist.
I bristled slightly at his commanding tone. "I know how to handle this."
Do you? Because it's been days and he's still breathing.
Hogus snapped.
Use his emotions against him. Pretend you're still on his side if you have to. Do whatever it takes.
His words settled uneasily in my chest. "I'll handle it," I said sharply before ending the call. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, glancing at the clock on Clara's wall. An hour had slipped by, just like that. I cursed under my breath. "Everything okay?" Clara asked from the living room. "Yeah," I said, grabbing my coat. "I've got to go. Thanks for the coffee offer, but I'll take a rain check." She waved me off, her attention already back on Buster. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, pulling my coat tighter around me. My mind was racing as I started the walk to Thomas's place. It wasn't just Hogus's words that were unsettling. It was the feeling that I was being pulled in directions I wasn't sure I wanted to go. But there was no time to dwell on it now. Thomas was waiting, or maybe he wasn't. Either way, I had to find out. When I arrived at Thomas's house, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. I pushed open the door. It wasn't even locked, and stepped inside. The place was empty. Not just empty as in unoccupied, but stripped bare. Not a single trace of him left behind. My stomach twisted. "Thomas?" I called, even though I knew I wouldn't get an answer. I searched every room, opening cabinets and drawers, hoping for some kind of clue. But there was nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned sharply, my hand instinctively brushing against the knife I kept tucked in my boot. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad, with a rugged face that looked like it had seen its share of fights. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady.
Lobrock.
He said, his tone calm but firm.
I used to be part of Thomas's pack.
His words made me freeze. "What do you want?"
I want to help you.
He said, stepping further into the room.
You're hunting him, aren't you?
I didn't respond, but the look in my eyes must have been enough.
Good.
Lobrock continued.
He needs to be stopped, for everyone's sake.
I crossed my arms, keeping a safe distance. "Why should I trust you?" He let out a bitter laugh.
You think I'd defend someone like him? Thomas ruined our pack, destroyed everything we built. He's dangerous. You have no idea what he's capable of.
I clenched my jaw. I've heard stories, but I've also heard his side. Lobrock stepped closer, his voice dropping.
And you believe him? Let me guess. He told you some sob story about how he's misunderstood, how he's the victim. That's what he does. He manipulates people, makes them feel sorry for him. But underneath it all, he's a monster. He took lives, innocent lives. And if you don't stop him now, he'll do it again.
His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Everything Hogus had told me was starting to line up. I hated how easily doubt crept in, but it was impossible to ignore. "Do you have proof?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Lobrock shook his head.
Proof? What kind of proof do you need? The bodies he left behind, the lives he destroyed? Sometimes you don't need proof, Laura. You just need to trust your gut.
I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy cloak. "If you're right," I said slowly, "then he needs to be stopped. But I need to find him first." Lobrock studied me for a moment before nodding.
Start where it began, where you met him. He's a creature of habit.
Lobrock left. I wondered. The nightclub. Of course. I left the house, my thoughts racing. The drive to the club was a blur, my grip on the steering wheel tighter than usual. When I arrived, the place was already buzzing with life, the music spilling out onto the street. Inside, the pulsing lights and thumping bass were disorienting, but I forced myself to focus. I scanned the crowd, looking for that familiar face, that presence I couldn't ignore. But he wasn't there. After an hour of searching, I stepped outside, the cool night air a relief against my flushed skin. He wasn't coming. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind a mess of emotions. Thomas wasn't just a mission anymore. He'd become something else, something I wasn't ready to name. But whatever connection we had, it was dangerous. I couldn't let it cloud my judgment. I pulled out the vial from my pocket, holding it up to the light. It was so small, so deceptively innocent-looking. But it was a weapon, and I was prepared to use it. Thomas and I weren't supposed to happen. Whatever this was between us, it had to end. I had to end it. With a deep breath, I slipped the vial back into my pocket and headed to my car. The night wasn't over, and neither was this fight. I opened the apartment door and tossed my keys onto the table by the entrance. The click of metal against wood felt louder in the empty silence. Evening had settled in, casting soft golden light through the windows. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness wrap around me. It had been a long, exhausting day, and the weight of failure pressed down on my shoulders like an anchor. I couldn't find him. Thomas. No matter how many places I searched, he was just gone. Dropping my bag onto the couch, I reached for my phone and scrolled to Hogus's number. If anyone had answers, it would be him. I hit call and brought the phone to my ear, pacing near the window as it rang. And rang. And rang. "Pick up, damn it," I muttered under my breath. But it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. My frustration boiled, but I shoved it down. Hogus had always been reliable. Maybe he was caught up in something. Or maybe he didn't want to answer. Either way, I needed a new plan. I rubbed my temples, my fingers brushing through strands of my hair as I thought. And then it hit me. Maeve. If anyone could help me figure this out, it would be her. She always had a knack for piecing together things I missed. I headed toward her room, already calling out, "Maeve? Are you home?" No answer. I pushed open her door, expecting to find her sprawled on the bed with a book or scrolling through her phone. Instead, I was greeted by an eerie emptiness. Her bed was neatly made, not her usual messy, hurried style. The room felt off. I stepped further inside, my eyes scanning the space. Her closet door was ajar, and something caught my attention. I walked over and pulled it open all the way. It was empty. Completely empty. Her clothes, her shoes, even the small shelf where she kept her scarves and jewelry, gone. My stomach twisted, an uneasy knot forming. I turned back to her dresser and opened the top drawer. Empty. The same with the second drawer. And the third. "What the hell?" I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. I sat down on the edge of her bed, gripping the edge of the mattress to steady myself. My thoughts raced. Maeve was gone. Not for the night, not out with friends. She was gone. I fumbled for my phone and dialed her number. It rang once, then twice, before the mechanical voice informed me, "The number you are trying to reach is currently switched off." No, I muttered, trying again. Same message. A strange emptiness filled my chest, spreading out like a quiet ache. Where had she gone? And why didn't she say anything? I tried to think of any clue, any conversation we'd had recently that might explain this, but my mind came up blank. I stayed there for a while, staring at the bare closet, the empty drawers. It felt surreal, like the pieces of my life were unraveling one by one. First Thomas, now Maeve. And then it hit me. There was no way this was a coincidence. Then I saw a note on the table.
Dear Laura, I know you'll be furious when you find this, but it's about time you hear my side of the story. You've always been the strong one, the confident one, the one who could walk into a room and command attention without even trying. Meanwhile, I've been stuck in your shadow. Always the other twin, the one who's just there. You took everything I ever wanted, whether you realized it or not. And this time, I decided I wouldn't let you have it all. It started when Thomas came looking for you. You weren't home, and I had no idea where you'd gone, but he was standing there, so tall, with that storm of emotions in his eyes. He looked like a man on the verge of breaking, and I understood why you couldn't resist him. He asked why you had left his house so abruptly, why you'd returned to the apartment without telling him anything. His voice was filled with hurt, and I could feel his vulnerability. And in that moment, I made a choice. I pretended. I was you. I know you'll hate me for it, but can you blame me? You always had everything: looks, charm, the ability to make any man fall for you. You barely had to try. And me? I've always been invisible, the wallflower. But that night, I stepped into your shoes, and for the first time, I felt what it was like to be you. He looked at me like I was his world, like I could heal the parts of him that were shattered. And when I kissed him, he kissed me back. I could feel his longing, his pain, and I wanted to be the one to take it all away. I wanted him to see me, not as Maeve, but as the woman who could love him better than anyone ever could. We spent the time in bed. Together, Laura. I'm not ashamed of it. For once, I felt alive, like I mattered. We made love, and it wasn't just physical. It was emotional, raw, and real. He thought I was you, but in those moments, I wasn't pretending anymore. I was just a woman who finally felt seen, who finally felt loved. Before I realized it, my feet carried me closer to him, my hand reaching out almost instinctively. My fingers brushed against his arm, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt through me. He turned, his gaze meeting mine, filled with something I couldn't quite name. A mix of longing and hesitation. "Thomas," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't reply, but his eyes held mine, searching, questioning. Slowly I reached up, my hand pressing against his chest. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat thudded against my palm, strong and sure. I leaned in, letting my lips graze the spot where his heart beat. It was a small, tentative gesture, but it felt monumental. That one kiss was like the opening of a floodgate. His hand came up to cup my face, his touch gentle but firm, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow at first, tender, as though he was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I pressed closer, letting the warmth of him seep into me, his strength grounding me in ways I hadn't known I needed. His hands slid down my arms, brushing against my skin with a touch so light it sent shivers racing my heart. When his fingers reached the strap of my dress, he hesitated, his eyes flicking to mine. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat. He slid the strap down, his fingertips grazing the curve of my shoulder, then his lips followed. He kissed the exposed skin near my heart, his mouth warm and soft, each touch igniting something deep within me. My hands found their way to his hair, threading through the thick strands as he continued to map a path of kisses along the curve of my collarbone. "Laura," he breathed against my skin, his voice barely audible. I froze for a moment, the weight of the name settling between us like a fragile thread. But then his lips found mine again, and all doubts faded into the background. He pulled me closer, his hands moving to the small of my back, holding me like I was something precious, something he didn't want to let go of. The fabric of my dress slipped lower, pooling around my waist, and the cool air against my skin was nothing compared to the heat radiating from his touch. I reached for him then, my hands trembling slightly as they moved over the hard lines of his body. His breath hitched as I traced the planes of his chest, my fingers memorizing every curve, every ridge. "Is this okay?" I asked, meeting his gaze. He smiled, the kind of smile that made my knees weak. "It's more than okay," he said, his voice soft but steady. I leaned in, letting my lips follow the path my hands had taken, tasting the saltiness of his skin, feeling the way his muscles tensed under my touch. He let out a low groan, the sound reverberating through me, filling me with a satisfaction I couldn't quite put into words. I froze for a heartbeat, but he didn't seem to notice. His hands slid to my hips, pulling me closer, and in that moment, I let myself forget everything else. I let myself believe that this was mine, that he was mine. For tonight, at least, I could pretend. Afterward, I told him we needed to leave. I said we couldn't stay in this city, that it wasn't safe for us. He didn't question it. He agreed because he's tired of running, tired of being hunted for things he didn't do. And yes, Laura, he's innocent. He's not the monster you think he is. Thomas has never harmed a human in his entire life. By the time you read this, we'll be far away. I won't tell you where, because I know you'll try to find us. But let's just say we're on the other side of the country, where no one knows us, and no one will bother us. Thomas and I will start fresh, far from the chaos you left behind. You might be wondering why I did this, why I would betray my own sister. Well, let me tell you something, Laura. You're not my sister. Not really. But now I don't care. You're adopted. You're not even our mother's real daughter. Do you know what that means? It means that all those years when I watched you steal my spotlight, when I watched you take all the happiness that should have been mine, you had no right to it. You weren't her daughter, Laura. I was. You've been living a life that never belonged to you, taking what was meant for me. Well, not anymore. I've taken something back. For once, I'm the one who gets the happy ending. I'm the one who gets to love and be loved. And you? You can stay here and wallow in your anger, your confusion, your grief. I don't care. You deserve it. You always told me I needed to be stronger, to stand up for myself. Well, I finally did. I stood up and I took what I wanted. Now, I have Thomas, and I won't let you ruin this for me. My father had told me everything. Yes, my father. That's Hogus. Isn't it shocking for you? I am much more powerful than I ever realized. Hogus will take care of you, don't worry. Goodbye, Laura. I hope you enjoy the loneliness you left me with for so many years. Now it's your turn to feel what it's like to lose. Maeve.
I stared at the empty room. Maeve's room. The closet gaping wide like an open wound. My legs felt weak, my arms limp at my sides. She was gone. The sister I'd grown up with, laughed with, fought with, gone. My thoughts raced in circles, spiraling deeper into confusion. Had she really betrayed me? And Thomas, was he truly innocent? Or had Maeve simply twisted the truth to take what she wanted? The quiet of the apartment felt deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sank onto the bed, my fingers brushing over the wrinkled duvet. It still smelled like her, like vanilla lotion and faint traces of her favorite floral perfume. My heart ached, but my mind was too busy drowning in questions. How does she know I'm adopted? I whispered aloud, my voice trembling. Am I adopted? The words tasted foreign on my tongue. I tried to piece it all together, but the more I thought, the less everything made sense. A sharp knock at the door broke my spiraling thoughts. My head jerked toward the sound. Who could it be? My pulse quickened as I rose, cautiously making my way toward the door. The weight of all my unanswered questions dragged behind me like chains. When I opened the door, I was met by an older woman, her face lined with years of wear and tear. Her gray hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her eyes, sharp and calculating, met mine with a flicker of urgency.
Are you Laura?
She asked, her voice gravelly, as if it hadn't been used much lately. Yes, I said hesitantly, gripping the edge of the door. Who are you?
My name is Billy.
She said, stepping closer.
I'm your aunt, your mother's sister.
Her words hit me like a storm. My grip on the door tightened as I stared at her. My mother's sister?
Yes, and we need to talk.
She glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one was watching.
Can I come in?
I hesitated for a moment, but something about the look in her eyes told me she wasn't lying. I stepped aside, and she entered the apartment, her movements deliberate but weary, like someone who had been running for far too long. Billy didn't waste any time. She sat on the couch, folding her hands in her lap, and began speaking.
Hogus is not who you think he is.
She started, her voice steady but filled with bitterness.
He's a monster.
I sat across from her, gripping the arm of the chair. What are you talking about? What does Hogus have to do with me? Billy took a deep breath.
Your mother, my sister, was his victim, just like me. Hogus trapped her in a web of lies, made her believe he loved her, and then he started experimenting on her. He was obsessed with creating hybrids, part human, part supernatural. Your mother was his first test subject. And Maeve was the result of those experiments.
The room seemed to tilt, and I clutched the armrest harder. Maeve is a hybrid? My voice cracked, disbelief dripping from every word. Billy nodded solemnly.
Yes. But you, Laura, you're not adopted. I know Maeve must have claimed that you're adopted. I knew because Hogus tells me everything in his overconfidence. You're your mother's only biological child. Hogus has been lying to Maeve, manipulating her into thinking otherwise. He's using her, just like he used your mother.
I shook my head, trying to process it all. Why? Why would he do this? Why does he want to hurt us? Billy's eyes darkened.
Because you're a threat. Your skills, your sharp mind, he knows you're capable of uncovering the truth. And Maeve, her existence as a hybrid could expose everything. If the government finds out what Hogus has been doing, he's finished. That's why he's trying to eliminate you both. Step by step. He is a mastermind. And Thomas...
I leaned forward, my breath catching. What about Thomas?
Hogus used Thomas as his scapegoat. In back early days, Hogus was a friend of Thomas's father. Thomas and Hogus knew each other, but Thomas never knew the monster hiding inside Hogus.
Billy said grimly.
Thomas tried to save your mother when she escaped, but Hogus got to her first. Then he blamed everything on Thomas, painted him as a monster, a rogue werewolf to cover his own tracks. Hogus always told me about his plans. Hogus never thought I will manage to escape one day.
I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about Hogus, about Maeve, about Thomas, it was all lies. Billy leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper.
Laura, you need to leave this city now. Hogus won't stop until you and Maeve are both gone. He's ruthless and he has resources. You're not safe here. As Hogus's plan to finish Thomas from your hands is failed or taking too long, so he will come for you.
I stared at her, my mind spinning with everything she'd just told me. But Maeve, she's with Thomas now. I have to find her. I have to warn her. Billy shook her head.
Maeve may not listen to you. Hogus has planted too many lies in her mind. But you can still protect yourself. If you stay, you'll be playing right into his hands.
I wanted to argue, to tell her I couldn't just leave. But deep down, I knew she was right. Hogus was a monster, and I was standing in his crosshairs. Billy stood, placing a hand on my shoulder.
You're stronger than you think, Laura. Don't let him win.
Her words hung in the air long after she left, and I sat there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of it all. I didn't know what my next move would be, but one thing was clear. I couldn't trust anyone, not even the people I thought I knew. Billy left just as suddenly as she'd arrived, muttering something about needing to keep moving before Hogus tracked her down. I watched her figure disappear down the hallway, her warnings still ringing in my ears. My body felt heavy with the weight of everything I'd just learned, but there wasn't time to sit and process. I had to act. I threw together a bag in a rush, shoving clothes and a few essentials into my duffel without much thought. My hands trembled as I zipped it up, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror above my dresser. My long, red-blonde hair was messy, falling over my shoulders, and my eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. I looked like someone who hadn't rested in years, because in some ways, I hadn't. I pulled on a jacket, grabbed my bag, and stepped out into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess every sound. A single cab idled at the curb, its driver leaning casually against the hood, smoking a cigarette.
Need a ride?
He called, flicking the cigarette onto the pavement. Yeah, I replied, my voice firm. I didn't have time to waste. To the airport. He opened the trunk, tossing my bag inside, and I climbed into the back seat. The driver didn't say much as we pulled onto the road, which suited me just fine. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was almost soothing. I stared out the window at the dark trees lining the road, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. I tried to focus on the plan, get to the airport, get out of the city, figure out the rest later, but the questions wouldn't stop swirling in my mind. Why had Maeve betrayed me? Was she really working with Hogus? Or had she been manipulated like the rest of us? And Thomas, where did he fit into all of this? The car jolted suddenly, pulling me out of my thoughts. What's going on? I asked, leaning forward. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror.
Gotta check something. Won't take long.
He pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out, leaving the engine running. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. The road was deserted, surrounded by dense trees, and the way he moved, too casual, too deliberate, set my nerves on edge. I grabbed the door handle, my pulse quickening. Stepping out, I left my bag behind without a second thought and started walking quickly down the road. I didn't care about the driver or his car. I just needed to get to the airport. But then I saw him. Hogus. He stood in the middle of the road, holding a weapon that glinted in the moonlight. His presence was like a shadow, dark and oppressive, and it stopped me in my tracks. I spun around, ready to run back the way I'd come, but there she was. Maeve. Her silhouette emerged from the trees, her hands gripping a weapon of her own. Her face was eerily calm, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Maeve!" I called out, my voice breaking. "Don't listen to him. He's lying to you. He's a monster. I don't care if you're a hybrid. We grew up together. We're sisters, and we always will be." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she spoke, her tone cold and detached.
It doesn't matter. You took my place, Laura. You took everything that was supposed to be mine. I deserve to be happy too.
I barely had time to process her words before Hogus started walking toward me, his weapon raised. "Where's Thomas?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Did you manipulate him too?" Maeve smiled, a cruel, hollow smile, and said nothing. She stepped forward, dropping her weapon to the ground.
You know what?
She said, her voice laced with an eerie confidence.
I don't even need a weapon.
Her body began to change before my eyes. Her limbs elongated, her muscles rippling as her skin shifted and darkened. She was transforming, becoming something neither human nor wolf, but a terrifying blend of both. My breath caught in my throat as she lunged toward me, her claws slashing through the air. I tried to dodge, but her first strike raked across my back, the pain searing and immediate. I stumbled forward, falling to the ground, and her shadow loomed over me.
Father!
Maeve called out, her voice triumphant.
I can handle this on my own. Just watch.
But when she turned to look for Hogus, he was gone. Her expression faltered, confusion flickering across her face. Before she could react, something blurred past me, moving faster than I could follow. Maeve let out a guttural snarl, and when I looked up, she was no longer standing over me. I struggled to my feet, clutching my injured back, and saw them. Maeve and a massive black werewolf locked in a fierce battle. It didn't take long for me to realize who it was. "Thomas," I whispered. At a distance, I spotted Hogus lying unconscious on the ground. Whatever had happened to him, I didn't care. My focus was on the fight in front of me. Maeve was ferocious, but Thomas was stronger. It was clear he would win, and as I watched, a horrible thought crossed my mind. He might destroy her. "Stop!" I shouted, stepping out of the car. "Thomas, stop!" He froze, his massive form towering over Maeve, who lay battered and barely breathing on the ground. Slowly, Thomas shifted back into his human form, his face etched with regret. Maeve's voice was faint, but audible.
Thomas, I love you.
I knelt beside her, tears streaming down my face. "Why, Maeve? Why did you do this?" She looked at me, her expression softening for the first time.
It was never about being a hybrid, or not being your real sister. I just wanted to be like you, to live like you. But I couldn't. I didn't know how to love you the way I should have. And now, I have to pay for that.
Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I leaned over, wrapping my arms around her, despite the blood and the pain. "You're my sister, Maeve. You always will be." Thomas watched us silently, his expression unreadable.
I'm sorry.
Maeve whispered, turning her gaze to Thomas.
For everything I did to you. I pretended to be Laura. I tried to take you away. But you knew it wasn't her, didn't you? You somehow realized that I am not Laura when we were on the way to another city.
Thomas crouched beside her, his voice low and firm.
You fooled me at first, but slowly, I knew. You may look like Laura, but you'll never be her. Her love is deeper than anything you could ever fake.
Maeve smiled faintly, her strength fading.
Finish it.
She said, her voice barely audible. Thomas hesitated, looking at me.
Laura, what should I do?
I shook my head, my voice breaking. She's my sister, Thomas. I can't. Maeve's smile widened, and she let out a weak laugh. Maeve, listen to me, I whispered, my voice breaking. Hogus is the real monster. Not me, not Thomas. He's the one who tore us apart. Maeve's lips curled weakly.
You're lying.
She rasped. No, Maeve. Hogus did this to you. He used you. He wanted you dead all along. She tried to shake her head but winced in pain.
No. Hogus was...
He doesn't love you, Maeve. I cut in desperately. He loves himself, his power, his filthy, illegal work. You were never part of his future. He was going to finish you the moment you weren't useful anymore. Maeve's expression flickered with doubt, then sorrow. She exhaled shakily.
Even if that's true, it doesn't matter now, because I'm taking my last breaths.
Somewhere in my deep heart, I knew that she had ditched me, and maybe she deserved this. But she was my sister. At least for me, she was my sister.
You think she's innocent, Thomas? She was poisoning you. In your coffee, your drinks, she wanted to finish you.
I cannot believe you, Maeve. You are just heartless. I said, trying to keep my voice stable. Thomas didn't look surprised. He glanced at me, his expression calm.
I already knew, Laura. I knew you were a hunter. But I also knew Hogus manipulated you into believing I was the enemy. I had already saw Hogus's name in your phone, and that day I knew it. But I didn't took any action. I just let the things happen as God wants. I don't blame you.
Shame washed over me, and I couldn't meet his eyes. If you want to finish me too, I won't stop you, I said quietly. Thomas stood, his voice steady.
You had plenty of chances to finish me, but you didn't. That tells me everything I need to know.
I looked up at him. Where are you going?
To figure out where I stand in all of this.
He said, turning away. Thomas, wait! I ran after him, grabbing his arm. Don't walk away. I need you. He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine.
I am not any more worth it, Laura.
It's not like that, I said. Thomas stared at me with sad expressions and said,
I had slept with.
I know. But it was not your fault, I interrupted before he could complete his words.
Do you forgive me, Laura, for what I did?
Thomas asked. I'm worse than you, I admitted. I tried to destroy you.
You didn't, or even if you did, it was your job. And you never knew the truth. The truth about me.
He said simply. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything between us hanging in the air. Then, before I could stop myself, I kissed him. It wasn't soft or gentle. It was desperate, urgent, like we were both trying to forget everything that had happened. When we pulled apart, I whispered, Stay with me. He smiled faintly.
For tonight?
For as long as you want, I said.
Then I'll stay forever.
He replied. And what about your enemies and family? I asked.
Let's see what I can do. Maybe I should claim my position back.
Thomas said with a confidence. I raised an eyebrow. I see. Then we walked, holding each other hands. My body was paining, but Thomas's warm company was much more relieving than my pains. I wondered about Maeve. Why was she so jealous of me? What did I do with her? I had loved her so much, but she... Then Thomas asked,
Are you okay?
Yes, I replied, and then kissed his lips. Thomas and I walked toward our destiny,